people in the security space would definitely say if you show weakness, then Russia will be more likely to attack you.
Do you think that Germany is at risk of going to war against Russia? This is James Jackson, an independent British journalist based in Berlin. He covers news for publications such as the BBC, Sunday Times, Time Magazine, and others.
We're in Berlin, right? Berlin is the site where Hitler shot himself, and it wasn't through negotiations. It was through absolute defeat of the Nazi menace.
He recently produced a documentary for the BBC about the victims in Mariupol.
We just saw a lot of destruction on the European continent to, I think, a scale that we haven't seen since the Second World War. In Germany, I think we've got a tough decade coming ahead.
How do you keep optimism?
I'm not an optimist.
We want to thank one of our sponsors for supporting this podcast. WonderTax is a platform that makes your tax declaration in Germany easy. Try it out for free and only submit if you're fully satisfied. Visit gutentag.wondertax.de and give it a try. Now, without further ado, let's start with the conversation. Welcome, James. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You're from England.
I am, yes.
And how do you end up doing what you do in Berlin?
I think that's a really good question. I always just love Berlin, but ultimately, I think I made a kind of spur of the moment decision when I was about 13 years old, and they offered me to learn Spanish in school or German. Cannot remember why I chose German, but in a way, this like spontaneous decision kind of impacted the rest of my life quite a lot. So later on, I started coming to Berlin, going to clubs and DJing even at clubs, and it was a great time. But ultimately decided to make the move here after Brexit for some kind of political reasons, and then I got my break in journalism while I was here as well. So in some ways, Berlin I've got a love-hate relationship sometimes, but it's been good to me in other ways.
You were telling me that you have lived in multiple places there. You have been in the Philippines and in India. So you have a very broad vision of the world, probably.
I had quite an international childhood, I guess you could say. Yeah. But and I travel a lot as well. So I feel lucky to be able to do that, being freelance and stuff. But I think, one positive about that is that you can see things from a bit of outside of your national boundaries a little bit, right? So for me, the Brexit discussion was always quite small-minded, and I guess maybe you can see some inner German debates that are also, when you're looking at it from outside, it can give you a bit of a clarity, right? Like, because you're not as emotionally invested in stuff.
Yeah, we have heard for example, from many of the people who we have interviewed that they took this Brexit as a very personal thing that made them change the decision. Where do I go? Where do I move? Actually, couple of the people we had in the podcast, they said, after Brexit, I decided, okay, I stay in Germany. And did it really change the vibe there, or was it more like...
I think Brexit for a lot of Brits was kind of the end of a process, or at this point, it's kind of maybe was even the start of a process of longer term decline. And for me, it was this sense of being shut off from the rest of the world, which I had always felt quite open to. I mean, when I was a student, I used to organize conferences in like Central Europe, in Austria and Slovakia, places like that. And so I always personally felt quite connected to Europe and Central Europe as well. And Brexit kind of felt like the door was closing, so it was time to get out, and I managed to do that, but not everyone else did, and you can see what's happening in the UK right now. It's kind of scary, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I was checking the news, and we always hear this stuff that left or radical left are normally protesting in a violent way, making it sound like when it's about right-wingers, they are more pacifist, they're more civilized, and now we're seeing the opposite.
That is definitely the narrative that a lot of people push, right? That the left has been very disorderly in this time, and I think something we're probably going to talk about is Palestine protests, right? And some people have made the comparison. Actually, hang on, like yes, we've had graffiti, yes, we've had chants at the Palestine protests, but what we haven't actually had is people being attacked or gangs of people hunting down Jews or foreigners or whatever. And we're seeing that right now in the UK. And I think it's actually a very worrying time. What it started from was effectively fake news. There's been a powder keg building up of pressure, but basically there was a very tragic incident where 3 girls were killed by a man who was initially reported to be a Muslim and have come over on small boats, which is, what they call rubber dinghies, these boats which some people use to enter the UK. Both of those claims were untrue. He was born in the UK, born in Wales, and was born the child of Rwandan immigrants, but was born, in the UK, and was not a Muslim at all. So I think what we're really seeing is the coming together of a number of factors. So anti-immigrant sentiment, which has been politically very important in the UK for a long time, right? Politicians often attack immigrants. I think Islamophobia plays a big role as well. It's been Islamophobia or, skepticism towards Muslims, hatred towards Muslims has been pretty important since at least 9/11, if not before. I had the feeling it died down, actually, but I may have been wrong about this. I think people are just also very frustrated and they don't see things getting better. So we have a bit of a problem of antisocial behavior in the UK, actually. And I think people are a bit more into fighting and hooliganism and stuff. And so in the end, I think, we shouldn't make it too political. I think some of this is just people drinking, taking drugs, and wanting to fight, and being racism being a part of this as well.
Hey, lieve Freunde. Sorry to interrupt this amazing conversation, but I need a little bit of help. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can probably see the subscribe button. If you do, it would mean the world to us if you can subscribe. That's the best way to support the show. Because when you do, I can show it to potential guests and potential brands and stuff like that. And it really helps to grow the show in so many ways. Have cooler conversations, cooler guests, and it just helps in everything so much. So if you don't mind, thank you so much. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Okay, but this mistake that they did with this person, it was something that the media did or something that it was political?
It was far-right influencers, people like Nigel Farage is a politician, right? So, and one of the most important politicians in modern UK history, you could argue, because of his role in Brexit. But also, I think Andrew Tate, a number of people said it was, a Muslim who came over on a small boat, and that happened to be what everyone was mad about anyway, right? So it kind of lit the touch paper to this powder keg, but then it didn't have any basis in reality. That came out quite quickly afterwards, that it wasn't true, but it didn't stop any of these. I mean, people could call them riots. I think it's actually more accurate to call them pogroms, because as well as seeing property damage, we're seeing groups of white people heading out on the street and just attacking someone based on the color of their skin, which I have to be honest, I never expected to see in Britain in my lifetime. So very depressing.
I mean, I saw some videos on social media how they are going into hotels where asylum seekers are staying, or windows for places where they live. And I only thought, remember the 9th of November, 1930. What? 33, was it?
Oh, yeah. You mean Kristallnacht, yeah.
Seems, I see the parallel very obvious there. They're burning down places, breaking windows.
So I guess the difference there would be these riots, these pogroms are spontaneous. So it's funny you bring that up, because I actually recently produced a mini doc for the BBC on Kristallnacht. So that will be out in a couple of weeks, actually. Where we interviewed a survivor, and he's still alive, which is crazy to me. So old, but 94 years old, but could speak completely coherently and remember a lot of it. I think with Kristallnacht, it wasn't a spontaneous kind of pogrom like we saw throughout the Russian Empire previous to that. It was state organized. So the word pogrom comes from Russian, and it was more common in the Russian Empire. But what we call Kristallnacht in Germany is called the Reichspogromnacht, and Kristallnacht was kind of the Nazi name for it. So they actually, like Germans nowadays, don't use the term Kristallnacht because they think it sounds too good. I kind of disagree with that. I think it sounds like broken glass. That's not a good thing, right? But ultimately, the Nazis were involved in organizing Kristallnacht. So whereas what we're seeing is more spontaneous in the UK. Obviously, it's building on rhetoric by politicians. I think if I'm not mistaken, the hotel that was actually attacked was complained about in Parliament by the Labour MP of the area. So we've had the left and the right, or the centre left, you should say, kind of taking up a lot of the same language as the right on these issues of migration, what are called small boats, these slogans which were associated with the previous government, who were very right-wing and lost the election. But I guess it's part of the Labour Party's strategy to pick up some of their terms, and so as they can't be attacked for it. But it doesn't seem to have worked, right? Because three weeks into their government, we've got like some of the worst pogroms and riots that we've seen in decades.
Yeah, that's quite impressive what I've seen there. And coming back from the island to the mainland in Europe, how do you navigate it at the beginning with a whole political spectrum in Germany? How do you get to understand what is going on and the different parties, the different things that are going on here?
Sure. So I will admit that I'm a bit of a politics nerd.
Yeah.
And I think Germany's great if you're a politics nerd, because there are so many parties and you have different regional coalitions. So there's a lot of like granular elements that you can dig down into. You don't just have the federal government, you have different coalitions and state levels and stuff like that. But when I first came, it was during the kind of honeymoon of Merkelism, or rather I should say when this was after Brexit, after Donald Trump, and everyone was looking to Angela Merkel as the sort of leader of the free world at that point, I think. She was dubbed by some, and there was some iconic photo of her standing up to Trump and stuff. And there became a bit of a cult of personality around her, which on the one hand, you can say she managed to keep Germany very calm. And since she left, a lot of the tensions that were kind of bubbling away underneath have come to the fore. Her successors in the traffic light coalition have not had an easy job. But I do also think it's fair to say that she laid the ground for a lot of the problems we're seeing, particularly with relying so heavily on Russian gas for Germany's energy, which when Russia then invaded Ukraine 2 and a bit years ago, then it made it very difficult for Germany to replace its energy mix, and then also agreeing to shut down nuclear, which to me is actually a crazy decision, personally speaking.
But it feels more that, for me, feels that was more like the pressure of the Greens and of the people who follow the Greens who wanted that no matter what.
They definitely play a role in it, but and I think there was a social. It was a very successful political movement, the anti-nuclear movement in Germany.
When they shut down the last one, it was celebrated as if they would have won a war, and I thought, wait a second, why are you all celebrating?
Yeah, while we were still burning a lot of fossil fuels, and immediately after some were shut down, the usage of fossil fuels went up. So, but I will say the majority of Germans do not really agree with shutting it down, but it was very much political pressure. It was like what you could call a generational project from the Greens, and they won. And I think it's really quite depressing that the biggest Green victory was, in my view, like an own goal. It was actually a defeat for the environment, because it has made it harder for Germany's businesses to stay running, probably contributed to inflation, and then that makes people mad, and then more people feel poor and more people support the far right. So it's not all about energy. It's not all about cost of living. I think Merkel did some good things, but she also, in terms of foreign policy, made some very questionable decisions, as well as in investment. I think Germany's a lot of studies have showed that Germany's suffered from a lack of investment. We can kind of see it now with Deutsche Bahn, right? We all complain about Deutsche Bahn being late, and a lot of the time it's because they're doing repairs, because Merkel didn't actually want to spend any money while she was in government, so they have to do the repairs now. And obviously, if the tracks are getting old, then it takes more time, it takes more money.
In terms of this dependency on Russian oil or on Russian gas, I mean, I understand maybe the reason behind it, because I think in geopolitics, if you want to keep peace or stability between two countries, you create a dependency that is a win-win for both. For example, United States and China, they have this dependency. Okay, you build stuff for us, so there's less of the risk of potential nuclear war or a real a real war.
Mhm.
Right now with Trump, they have this whole commercial war, and I can imagine that maybe back then, Merkel and Putin, they thought, okay, we have this commercial agreement. We don't go to war. We don't in favor of having this benefit for both of us. And then she leaves, and then somehow Europe is left with no real leadership after that. She was like kind of like ruling Europe, and there was some sort of stability. And do you think that that was why Russia decided to invade Ukraine, saying there's no leadership in Europe? Now's the moment.
I think that's a good question. I wouldn't say it was down to Merkel leaving. I think, as important as she was, and I agree with you in Europe, actually, there was a very good article in The Economist recently of Europeans complaining about how German infighting in the Ample coalition has meant that Europe is actually almost ungovernable now, because you talk to different ministries and it's like you're talking to different countries. But in terms of Russia, Ukraine, I'm sure there were other reasons for why Putin took the time he did, but I think he was probably preparing for quite a lot longer before that. The argument that you just mentioned, that if we're trading with each other, we won't even have a war, that's quite a popular one in Germany, in particular the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, who have this idea called Wandel durch Handel, which is transformation through trade. And, historically, maybe there were some good arguments for it coming from the Cold War. But actually, I would say, it clearly didn't work with Russia. Yeah. And it's also a very convenient argument, I think, like, oh, we get rich and we're doing good. We don't have to make any tough decisions. And there are a lot of connections between, there's a bit of a idealization of Russia in German politics, particularly on the left. Some of it comes down to memory culture. Some of it comes down to guilt over the Second World War. In fact, Germany's current president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he implied in an interview that we owe the Russians Nord Stream 2 because of World War II. So the Nord Stream 2 being the gas pipeline that was going through the Baltic Sea against the wishes of all of the Central European countries between Germany and Russia. So there's this kind of idea in German politics of Germany and Russia kind of being brother or, frenemies, maybe is the best way to put it. They allied a little bit in the Second World War with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then they obviously fought against each other as well with Operation Barbarossa. Yeah. And ultimately, the Germans see the Russians as kind of equals, at least on a political level, because they're two big, influential, powerful countries. And of course, with the DDR, with East Germany, there were political links there as well. Vladimir Putin lived in Dresden for quite a while. And while he was a KGB officer, he speaks fluent German. Merkel, of course, was a Russian scholar in the sense that she even won school competitions, national competitions for school children for how good her Russian was in the DDR. Yeah, so she went over to Moscow. But I think she was always quite skeptical of the Soviet Union, right? At least that's what she says. But I do believe that Russia and Germany, they kind of feel like there's some unfinished business, and a lot of Germans want to see the best in Russia. Whereas a lot of people from Ukraine, from Poland would say Russia is an imperialist power that has dominated us for centuries. It's tortured our people, they've invaded us, they've annexed us, they've held us in dictatorships in the Soviet Union and before that as well. And a lot of those countries don't feel heard by Germany on these issues. And in particular, Nord Stream 2 was very, very unpopular. And it wasn't just Merkel who made that decision. It was also pressure from the SPD. So one thing you could say before 2022 is that every party, except probably the Greens, had some kind of relationship with Russia and had some, what now looks like problematic dealings with Russia.
I mean, it was hard to see it, I think. I mean, at the beginning, I thought it was just conspiracy theories propagated by United States of saying, yeah, they're going to invade. But it's hard to believe the United States when you listen to history and then you think, okay, they're just trying to make us go to war for nothing until in February, Russia invaded Ukraine, and then it change. Okay, so they're doing it. They're really doing it.
Definitely.
But also had to do with NATO.
So that was actually something that Germany played a big role in, actually. I think it was the Bucharest summit in, I'm guessing 2008, maybe 2012. I'm not sure about that. But basically, there was a push to get Ukraine and Georgia in NATO, and it was blocked by Merkel. So she was the one, because she said then the Russians would invade immediately,
And
right?
that happened.
Well, I think 2022, Ukraine wasn't actually getting that close to being in NATO, because after 2014, the Russian annexation of Crimea and parts of the Donbass, Luhansk, it would be really hard to add Ukraine to NATO, because it's kind of in an active conflict. So if you add them, then you probably, I don't think there is in the medium term, or there was in the medium term, any urge to put Ukraine into NATO. What I would say generally is that, Russia invades, whereas people join NATO relatively voluntarily, often because of the threat of Russia, right? So if you see that in the Baltic countries, then they really wanted to join Russia because they feel like it keeps them safe. NATO for them is a defensive alliance, which doesn't attack first, is part of the charter. You can kind of argue about how that applied to Afghanistan, because it was a NATO deployment in Afghanistan and after 9/11. So I think that's a valid point of criticism. But I would stress that NATO, because I know there are a lot of people who are very critical of NATO, but I would stress it's a defensive alliance, and if you don't like someone joining a defensive alliance, that maybe implies you want to attack them, right? Because why else would it be a problem? Because they can't really, if they're not going to attack you.
But but at the same time, they will put military bases on Ukraine.
Yeah, they could. That would have been a possibility for sure. Yeah. But I don't think it justifies any kind of invasion, right? So.
Yeah, but at the same time, also United States did not like very much that Russia put military bases in Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. So I would just say, zooming out rather than talking about, I think one thing that we could learn from this is that maybe America is not the only bad actor in the world, right? I grew up with the Iraq War, my country also being part of that, Afghanistan, all of this stuff. And I think it was quite easy to think damn, America's very bad, the kind of Noam Chomsky approach. And obviously there's some truth there. But I also think this has made it quite clear that Russia can also be very bad, as can, other actors in the region. Even if we look at the Middle East, supporting Assad, Russia has destabilized Syria. So a lot of people from Central and Eastern Europe, and I report a lot from Central and Eastern Europe, have very critical views of Russia, and I think quite understandably so, because for many centuries, in some cases, their countries have been occupied.
I mean, I think there's not a lot of people who would really honestly say that Putin is a good guy, or are they? I would say
in Russia there are,
but also,
but outside Russia, people who say he's a bad guy. But
the elected president of Mexico, Sheinbaum, she invited Putin.
Yeah, but it's not because you think he's a nice guy, but it's because more he's a powerful guy.
Yeah,
realpolitik, to use a German word.
You don't want to be you don't want to be hostile with the bad guy.
It's usually about energy, right?
No, but before invading Ukraine, you could see these pictures of Putin holding a puppy.
That guy was also scary for me.
Yeah.
Even before that.
But they tried to present this good image of Putin.
So scary also, that I will not say anything bad about him.
Yes, exactly. We've just seen a hostage deal. Who knows what he could achieve next?
Exactly.
The Tiergarten killer could come and get you.
For example, yeah, exactly.
The Tiergarten killer was released in a hostage negotiation where, I think it sort of shows the asymmetries here. Russia had captured random journalists and activists, and then they had to swap. They swapped those, members of civil society for assassins and spies and stuff. So it kind of shows you the people we're dealing with. And, some people have criticized the deal and said this means that they're going to kidnap more journalists so that they can have more leverage to get their spies or their assassins back.
Yeah. You have talked with a lot of people from Ukraine, right? Yeah, I heard the documentary. You talk a lot with the people from Mariupol. After doing those interviews, what was your feeling about what is going on there?
I mean, so for people who don't know, I did a documentary for the BBC earlier this year for the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, looking at how international law works and documenting war crimes, what it means, and what this kind of struggle for justice on an international level looks like. And I think these are also lessons we can apply to other conflicts, Israel-Gaza, for example. But at the time, I was just shocked by along with many Ukrainians, I was shocked by the kind of brutality because Mariupol was in the east, right? It was one of the more pro-Russian cities, you could argue. Like, I was only ever a minority of people who identified as Russian, but it was a much bigger minority there than others. And so actually one of the guys I interviewed who didn't make it into the documentary, he was actually a Russian. And a lot of these people, a Russian citizen born and raised there and had just moved there because a lot of people have family ties on both sides of the borders. And a good friend of mine also wrote a book about this, Jen Stout, who wrote Night Train to Odessa, which I have to recommend. So they were all shocked because, they didn't like Putin, but they were surprised or shocked that soldiers would come and start committing war crimes, right? So just torture people. Bucha, for example, a infamous example of that, rapes, a lot of sex violence, and that's something that's very hard to report on because people often don't want to talk about it. So the people I spoke to at the Lemkin Center were putting together reports about sexual violence, and I spoke to them rather than directly to victims because they had an all-female team, many of whom were Ukrainian refugees themselves. One of the key characters was Katerina, who was one of the last ambulance drivers in Mariupol. So what they saw is similar to what you would see in the movie 28 Days from Mariupol, is it? I forgot what it's called, but the name slipped my mind. But you would just see people just being random civilians being shot. She estimated she saw thousands of bodies. So the Ukrainian army wasn't that present there. So we just saw a lot of death and destruction on the European continent to, I think, a scale that we haven't seen since the Second World War, with the possible exception of the Bosnian War.
With the current elections in the United States, also talking about if the next one will keep supporting the war or not. Germany also has been supporting with delivery of weapons. And do you think that Germany is at risk of going to war against Russia?
So getting more involved, I think, is true in the sense that by backing Ukraine, Germany is more involved in that conflict. But I do not agree that it makes things more risky for Germany. I actually would argue that showing weakness is what would make Germany itself become at risk, because right now a lot of people within NATO, within the Western alliance, think that Germany is a bit of a weak link because it has this strong pacifist tradition, and as well as having the AfD, which is quite consistently pro-Russian, as well as groups like the BSV, a newer party led by Sarah Wagenknecht. And a lot of people in the security space would definitely say, if you show weakness, then Russia will be more likely to attack you. So the idea isn't that you're provoking them by helping Ukraine defend itself. The idea is that you are defending yourself by helping Ukraine keep this hostile power at bay.
I hear a lot of the rhetoric from the AfD. I don't buy a single piece of what they say. But let's talk about Sarah Wagenknecht.
Happily.
She's a bit less, or from my perspective, less crazy than people from the AfD.
From the AfD? Sure, yeah.
She talks about, we cannot achieve peace by going to war. We achieve peace by sitting down and trying to find a common agreement. What is your view on that?
I think it's a really nice idea, but I think it's it's always a bit weird to me when Germans make that argument, because, then Germans are known for understanding their history and stuff. And no one could sit down with the Nazis, right? The Western powers tried to do that with the Munich Agreement when Germany marched into Czechoslovakia. And, they thought, oh, we just give them the Sudetenland and then it will be fine. And then they took the whole of Czechoslovakia. And so, we're in Berlin, right? Berlin is the site where the Nazis were defeated, where Hitler shot himself. And it wasn't through negotiations. It was through absolute defeat of the Nazi menace. So for me, I'm not really into this idea. But I think ultimately, any conflict in Ukraine will probably end in some kind of negotiation. I think it's about giving Ukraine the best hand possible in those negotiations. And, a lot of people would say that's by giving them better weapons. And I'm not against that. I'm in favor of it for sure. I think one thing that's interesting about Sarah Wagenknecht, her party, is that recently there was a study that came out that she's actually more popular with migrants than children of immigrants, let's say, which you might find confusing or weird or surprising at least, because one of her main platforms is not just the pro-peace thing, it's also anti-migration, right? This is what caused a lot of her troubles within the left party that she split from. She was always more from the less liberal wing, the more like they wanted to stop or reduce migration because they said it was neoliberal and wanted a kind of maybe a socialism in one country. So I think, however, it is her pro-peace rhetoric, particularly in the Middle East, as well as Ukraine, that can kind of bring together different groups of voters. So I would say German Turks in the west of Germany as one example, and then disaffected Social Democrats in the east of Germany. She's doing quite a good job for a new party of bringing these disparate voter groups together, which is what you really need to win. I think she got 8%, maybe 11% in the Euros, and she's polling very well in some of the upcoming state elections, which is really quite impressive for a new party in a political landscape like Germany, where you don't get that many new parties. The newest one, apart from that, is the AfD that's had any kind of breakthrough.
I hear a lot of her debates on TV, on German TV. She's really good on
very articulate.
Yeah. And who doesn't want peace? That will be the other thing. And then the rhetoric, anti-migrant rhetoric, is I don't perceive it as xenophobic. I perceive it as we cannot take everyone. So let's do it with, let's control it. Let's do it in order. Let's try to find a way to do it properly, not on a xenophobic basis like the AfD that says they are not real Germans or they're going to destroy our culture, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think one thing that's worth pointing out, actually, if you look at her MPs in Parliament, I think she took 10 MPs with her. Almost all of them have a migration background themselves. In fact, Sarah Wagenknecht is half Iranian. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and she even changed her name when she was growing up. She used to have it written in the German way, but she changed it to the more kind of Iranian, Middle Eastern spelling with the H in the middle rather than at the end. And of course, you've got some other characters in there, Sevim Dardelen, who's Turkish. And I think she is a little, we can agree maybe that Sarah Wagenknecht is quite a good speaker, and I'm actually hoping to interview her soon. But I think some of the people in her party are a little bit more extreme, maybe, and Dardelen would be one of those for me, where even came out quite recently with transphobic stuff about this Olympic boxer, and then very much hitting the West is bad button, which is, I think, in terms of foreign policy, which I personally don't agree with, as much as you should be able to criticize the West and for the bad things it does. I don't think that means we should then close our eyes to other countries and what they're doing wrong, right? Personally, I think democracy is good. So
she, in a way, split the left. And talking about the left, there is a term that I heard a lot lately on some news and also in some post on X, previously called Twitter, about the Anti-Deutsch. That is part of the left wing or extreme wing, left or radical left. And you have written a lot about that. Can you explain me a bit, what is this anti-Deutsch movement?
So the anti-Deutsch movement is something that I've covered quite a lot, as you said. They came from the German radical left. I think it's debatable whether they're still left-wing, although for me, it's not really my place to, play this argument of who's left-wing and who's not. But I would say that they have eschewed a lot of typically left-wing causes. They're very much against kind of liberation, like national liberation, except for Israel. I'll give you a little potted history of the Anti-Deutsch. So they started out during German reunification or just beforehand, and they were radical leftists, kind of from the squat autonomist scene, it was called, kind of anarchists. And they effectively argued that Germany was, if it reunified, was at risk of becoming a Fourth Reich. So they were kind of an outgrowth of the 68 movement, but they were very critical of former wings of the radical left for being anti-Semitic from the go. But initially, their main focus wasn't Israel, it was Germany. And they said their famous slogan was Nie wieder Deutschland, never again Germany. So it's like never again the Holocaust, never again Germany. They had this argument that there was something particularly dangerous about Germany, German nationalism, that meant that it couldn't be allowed to exist in the form of a reunified country again. What happened later on, they had a very kind of, they're quite reactionary, as you can probably guess from that. Even though it is quite an interesting take and quite a novel political view, they ended up kind of eventually opposing everything Germany was doing. That also meant that they opposed intervention in Bosnia, and certain figures were, almost praising Slobodan Milosevic from Serbia, the Serbian leader who committed, or who was involved in genocide against Bosnians. And they had quite a reactionary streak, and were also Islamophobic streak. And that became more and more prominent, but especially took off after 9/11. So after 9/11, they saw Muslims as a danger to the West. And, to me, a lot of their rhetoric sounds like Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. They kind of want to protect liberalism from this authoritarian threat that is radical Islam, or Islamism as they usually call it. But I think it's kind of, they're quite confused and they're quite obsessive, and they seem to interpret everything through German history. So it wouldn't be enough for them to say, Islamism is a conservative force and we should oppose it as progressives. They would then say, for example, that they're the new, like Muslims are the new Nazis, or BDS are the new Nazis, the boycott, divestment and sanction movement to oppose Israel, to boycott Israel. So everything is kind of viewed through the lens of German history. And as Germany has become more pro-Israel in the last 20 years, I think last 10 years especially, I think we've seen a kind of mainstreaming of what was previously a quite radical position of Germany wanting to be on the side of Israel, of opposing all kinds of boycotts as anti-Semitic, of interpreting everything through this lens of like German history, particular interpretations of anti-Semitism as well. So one of the key ideas is that anti-Semitism is not a form of racism, which is quite a bizarre idea, really, because, the Anne Frank Center say anti-Semitism a form of racism against Jews. Ultimately, all forms of racism are complex. I think anti-Semitism, you could say, is a particularly complex one, and it has a lot of history, especially because Jews can look like, European, Middle Eastern, Indian, Chinese even. So ultimately, I would argue, and I have argued, that the Anti-Deutsch started out as this kind of radical left-wing phenomenon, but through youth clubs and youth movements, they became more and more influential, to the point where almost every center left, every person left of center has kind of imbibed some of the ideas of the Anti-Deutsch. And ultimately, they don't oppose anything about Germany anymore, because Germany is radically pro-Israel, as are they. And this is why myself, as well as Leandros Fischer, an academic who's written on this topic, have started using the term ultra-Deutsch, because ultimately they are ultras. They're like football hooligans for the German national cause, which in a sense of replacement nationalism, Ersatznationalism, as people call it, is actually standing for Israel. So what we've seen is, and I will actually personally had a lot to do with the Anti-Deutsch when I moved here, because I've been interested in the Middle East since I was about 19. I went to Israel for the first time. And then later on, I went to a Jewish friend's wedding there. I went to Palestine. That kind of had some political influence on me. But I will say I've always maintained friends on both sides. Leftist Jews, conservative Zionist Jews, Palestinians. And then I came to Germany and I met people who talked a lot about Israel, but didn't actually have any real knowledge about the conflict or experience, or they were just, if you talked about Palestinian refugees, they would say, oh, well, Germans had to leave from East Prussia, I don't think they get their land back. So it's this kind of narcissistic German movement, effectively. And just last night, we saw an example of that. There was a Punks Against Anti-Semitism event in Leipzig, and on paper that sounds great. I mean, like, no one should be an anti-Semite, right? But it's almost being against anti-Semitism in Germany has almost become a dog whistle for being anti-Semitic. That's how backwards everything is here. Because at this Punks Against Anti-Semitism event, some Jewish Israelis went to protest, and one of them got quite physically assaulted by someone wearing an Against Anti-Semitism t-shirt. I really believe with some of this stuff, we're kind of through the looking glass. It's so crazy, and it's hard to explain to people outside. But then again, I think outside of the country, people maybe have an idea instinctively. Like if you grow up with this guilt and shame of being like the perpetrators of the greatest crime against Jews and against humanity arguably ever, then it might give you a bit of a psychologically twisted approach to this. But what I think is, and I think ultimately Germany needs therapy on this issue, but I think what's not really so easy for me to understand is that there are so many Jews who have Zionist or anti-Zionist, who have expressed their kind of doubts about how Germany deals with Jewish people, and they get shouted down quite aggressively. I would argue more aggressively than non-Jews. So I think you can actually see some anti-Semitism in the way that they approach Jews. And of course their stock argument would be, oh, well, Jews can be anti-Semitic too. It's like, well, maybe theoretically, but a Jew saying, I don't like Israel, I don't think there's anything anti-Semitic about that. I don't need 2 degrees in religious studies to say that. I happen to have 2 degrees in religious studies, but like really I think it's quite narcissistic, small-minded, and a lot of it is even just motivated by careerism, right? Like, there are particular influencers, writers, journalists. I'm not going to name names because they're not here to defend themselves, but you can make a great career in Germany as a non-Jew of pointing out why everything is anti-Semitic, and a lot of anything particularly relating to criticism of Israel. And whether this is an academic or a journalist, I remember there was the Humboldt University occupation, and someone had drawn like a pig, and a pig crossed out in graffiti. And that was a statement against police brutality or just anti-police statement. And a lecturer in anti-Semitism research said, this is about the medieval German view of the Judensau, which was an anti-Semitic image of Jews like drinking the milk of pigs, something like that, which interestingly is still up in some German churches as some kind of heritage thing. There was a debate about this. And she didn't understand the very basic political symbolism of a pig meaning like a police officer.
Yeah, in Spanish we call them puercos.
Yeah.
I don't know if...
I mean, like, it's in German they call them Bullen, which is bulls, right?
Yeah.
But like, I think everyone really should know that pigs is a symbol for police. And also when you're dealing, I think this comes down to the heart of why this conflict is so existential for Germany, because it's about what is German and what is Germany like. And ultimately, a lot of Germans want to keep Germany about their perceptions, their history, their cultural references, whereas particularly in the Palestine movement, there are plenty of people who are living in Germany but are not German, right? Migrants like us. So Palestinians as well as Americans for whom they might have no idea of the Judensau. I mean, I've spoken to Jewish commentators here who said, I learned about anti-Semitic stereotypes like flat feet being anti-Semitic from Germans. I had never heard it. So
I didn't know that either.
I mean, I don't know if that is the case, but it's like everyone needs to see. the anti-Deutsch and their kind of children, let's call them the ultra-Deutsch, right? They've created this environment where everything needs to be fact-checked against like an entire library of anti-Semitic literature from German history. And I think that's quite a dishonest way to approach this conflict. Of course, we should analyze and criticize all forms of anti-Semitism, but I don't think we should allow that to make us blind to Islamophobia, other forms of racism, because anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And I also think we should stop centering German feelings in this debate, frankly. In fact, the anti-Semitism commissioner of Berlin said to a friend of mine who's a Jewish Israeli, you need to be more sensitive to German feelings. I'm sorry, Jews do not need to be, and like there's to be paying attention to Germans on this. And also I think there's a certain kind of perverseness that comes from perpetrating a genocide and then saying you need to be sensitive to us afterwards. I mean, of course, like every individual deserves sympathy, but if you're using like your status as part of the nation that perpetrated it to ask for sympathy, I think that's frankly a bit weird and sad.
Very strange. Although, yeah, I mean, it might be hard to understand because for us, because I mean, if you grew up in a generation where you have been told your whole life the horrible things that your grandparents did, and as a nation, I cannot imagine how it is, because at least from our side, Mexico, we don't carry any historical guilt, right?
Not.
No.
We were conquered.
We were conquered, so we don't understand this feeling of having guilt for any country. I don't know if, for example, you as a Brit, you have.
I think arguably we could have a bit more guilt. You know?
Yeah, just that it hasn't been transmitted, right?
Yeah, and actually, I think this is. There was a really good essay in the Guardian a long time ago now about one of the reasons why people idolized at that period Germany a little bit was because it was seen as a country which had done the work of coming to terms with its history, right? Because you don't really get like much Holocaust denial. People say it was bad, whereas the bar is that low. But sadly, a lot of other countries don't see that, haven't even crossed that bar, whether it's Turkey, where Armenian genocide denial is very much mainstream, or the UK, where a lot of people have a sort of nostalgia for the empire, right? But I think it's also worth noting that Germany lost, and this was kind of imposed on them, whether it was by the Soviets in the East or the West. And I think we could ask ourselves, rather than this kind of post-1980s memory culture, the real is having Holocaust education in schools enough when so many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust got away with it in West Germany, and so many of the and they did that through collaboration with state structures which were filled with ex-Nazis who just completely got away with it. So well done for being above the tiny bar, but like let's look at how people got away with committing this crime rather than just saying we were all guilty, because maybe they were. I don't know how I feel about this idea that everyone's guilty, but there were definitely some people who are more guilty than others. Out of the top 10 richest families in Germany, 4 of them made their wealth in the Nazi period, right? And that's not most of them were car manufacturers, but also worked to provide stuff for the Wehrmacht, the army. And that doesn't get talked about that much. And that's kind of like an awkward point of discussion in German debates, because they don't deny it, but it's never like this is something we need to be really radically against anti-Semitism on. It happens to be that the issues that they're really radical with their fight against anti-Semitism are the same issues that can be used against migrants, left-wingers, and Muslims. There was actually a very good essay in Jacobin magazine about how the roots of this kind of crackdown on Palestine solidarity goes back to anti-communism in the Cold War, also by Leandros Fischer. And the SPD, among others, kind of implemented this idea of a wehrhafte Demokratie, a defensive democracy, which doesn't have the normal rules of freedom of speech, because Germany saw what Weimar liberalism leads to. So they need to be really strict on cracking down on threats to the republic. In the past, that was seen as communism, and they had bans on what was called the Radikale Erlass, which is anyone who was a member of the Communist Party which was banned, would be fired from their teaching job and stuff. And so we do see the German state, I think, going further in fighting perceived radicalism. But unfortunately, it's not always good at defining what radicalism is, because often it's interpreting things through this very German lens that not everyone's approaching things from.
Yeah, it's hard to see it from their eyes, because one can see it from their own experience and from the stuff that we have been taught through in school and through history. We have one lens where we see some stuff from one perspective, but they seem to have a very different one, because how do you grow up through all
and the media as well, right? Like the media propagates all of this stuff. If you look at how they report on Israel-Palestine, I think actually, you can say that's true across the Western world. Often it's, I think the famous example is often it's Israeli is killed, Palestinian dies, and they don't say who did it. It's this quite subtle stuff, but then also the bigger picture stuff. I mean, there's this horrible video going around of rape of a Palestinian prisoner and I don't think any mainstream news organizations in Germany or anywhere else has picked up on that, even though you can see
there was one article that says some Israel soldiers misbehaved with the Palestinian prisoners. So they use the word just misbehave.
Mishandled, genau. So they kind of watered down what was happening. And of course, there have been they don't do the same thing when it comes to the October 7th massacre by Hamas. So I actually saw earlier today the Tagesschau, or ARD, the kind of parent company of a lot of German broadcasters, said, we use newsy language, informative, we don't use emotive language. And one of the examples of words they used was brutal. We don't use the word brutal. But then an activist searched how they had used brutal, and in every case, or almost every case of describing the Hamas massacre, they did use the term brutal, and it was brutal. But here we see them going against what they say their journalistic standards are, to kind of take the side of Israel. And I think, if you have journalistic standards, the point is that it should apply in every case, right? Those are your standards, and you should stick to informing.
Yeah. We're talking about this colleague, a Mexican journalist who was beaten up by police during a demonstration, even though he had a press, ID. Do you think this is inherited from the police, this brutality, or is the system that is using the police that creates this brutality, or is the police themselves?
I don't think you can distinguish between that. I think it's really interesting to look at how the police handle pro-Palestine demonstrations, with even pro-Islamist demonstrations in Hamburg. There was quite a few thousand people going for calling for a caliphate.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and they kind of stuck to the rules. So again, this comes down to this quite German insistence on sticking to the rules. What they might argue is that the pro-Palestine movement don't stick to the rules, but you can argue about whether those rules are fairly applied. So, of course, you're not allowed to wear a keffiyeh. You're not in general at demonstrations. You're not allowed to wear anything on your face. It's called the Vermummungsverbot. But there've been images of people just wearing keffiyeh on their head, and then they just get grabbed even though it's not covering their face, or different. The rules have changed a lot as well, right? Like in schools, you were not allowed to, since October 7th, in schools, you were not allowed to wear a keffiyeh for quite a long time, even though it is a symbol. It's a Palestinian national symbol. It's almost like prohibiting people from wearing a kippah. Maybe it's not as a religious symbol, but it's certainly, or like prohibiting people from wearing Ukrainian colors or something like that. And we saw the German state taking quite illiberal steps immediately afterwards. Of course, there were also people who celebrated the attack, and they were punished. But I think the police, how they deal with Nazis and how they deal with what are quite often queer women of color at the Palestinian demos, as well as usually some young Palestinian men. I wonder if that's ideological or if that's something personal whether that's just, they're easier to grab, or the police are kind of a bit more scared. But I've been at these demos and stood next to the police because I have the privilege of the journalist. I have my press card. I don't go to demonstrations to demonstrate, but I go there to film. And I've heard the police say, "Yeah, wir machen es old school. Let's do it old school." And then they go in, like they bash their helmets together, like it's this quite macho display. Quite often, not every time. I have been to some demonstrations where they were, where they were outnumbered usually, and then they were a lot more reasonable. But I wonder how much of it's political, how much of it's maybe just toxic masculinity, actually, and why they don't do that at Nazi demonstrations, right? Well, you could argue the Nazis follow the rules. They go from A to B, but in a weird way, the Nazis are given less strict rules. So in Germany, it's illegal to do the Hitler salute. It's illegal to show a swastika, and the rule that is illegal under it's called the ban against anti-constitutional symbols. And there have been attempts to make From the River to the Sea an anti-constitutional symbol, and people have been charged for that. People have been charged for another Jew for a free Palestine. Quite often it's like the police seem to have misunderstood something. So I report a lot on Jewish Voice, Jüdische Stimme, and they had another Jew one of their activists had another Jew for a Free Palestine symbol with the Jewish Star of David in Palestinian colors, and the police took it off and they said, well, you could be arguing that we will kill another Jew for a free Palestine, right? So it's this very selective interpretation. And From the River to the Sea, I think this is a really important point. From the river to Palestine will be is a slogan that has predated Hamas by decades, and I think it has quite a loose meaning. I don't think that everyone. I've done polls of my followers, and there was also a court ruling in Mannheim about this that was very detailed and well received. Not everyone who says From the River to the Sea will be free is calling for a one-state solution, calling for the of Israel. Some people are saying, from the river, which is where the West Bank is, to the sea, which is where Gaza is, in that bit, all of Palestine will be and it's very much a taboo in German politics. It's arguably even illegal to call for what they call as the destruction or the extinguishing of Israel. But a lot of the people who, let's say, they support a binational state, where Israelis and Palestinians have the same rights, because there are equal numbers of Israelis and Palestinians in that area. And now they're currently, the ICC, the ICJ, sorry, recently ruled that Israel is in control of Gaza, of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem. So why is it anti-Semitic to say, I want everyone there to have equal rights and to live in a unified state? I mean, it's maybe it's not a realistic proposal. I think that's definitely arguable. But why is it illegal to question the existence or the right to exist of this state that has only been around for 70 years, and Germans would say it's about a Schutzort, it's about a protective space for Israel, for Jews, sorry, but on the one hand, they say it's a safe space for Jews. On the other hand, they say it's unsafe. So this is why we need to send them a third of their weapons or whatever. So there's a lot of contradictions there. I don't personally have a perspective on this, and I do try and stay neutral because I have been to Israel, I have been to Palestine. What
was your perception when you were there? Was it really an apartheid state there? Did you see a difference when you were there?
Well, the thing is, what was ruled in the ICC was that Israel is not. It wasn't that Israel is committing apartheid in Israel, it's that they're committing apartheid in the West Bank. And so when you enter and other occupied regions, including, East Jerusalem and Gaza, but when you actually it was different. It actually got more relaxed. I was there in 2023, early 2023, and it was much more relaxed. But when I was first there, which must have been about 10 years ago, when I first went over to Palestine, at least, there were really severe checkpoints. The freedom of movement was very much limited. And, there's a lot of conflict between Israelis. I've spoken to people and Palestinians, and they have some pretty nasty views about each other. And I think that's really tragic, right? Because in some ways there is actually like some elements of shared culture, and I don't think it's necessarily their fault that they're in this kind of situation, because Jews had to leave Europe because they didn't feel safe because of Germany, right? To bring it back to that. And I think I would actually be in favor of kind of Palestinians and Israelis like looking a little bit more, and the supporters on both sides looking a bit more of like, why is there this conflict? Like, why did Jews feel the need to flee Europe? And it's because of German anti-Semitism and European anti-Semitism more widely, right? And then of course Arab Israelis had to flee there later after the establishment of Israel. So I'm not here to say whether Israel is committing apartheid, but I will say that the highest court in the world said it was. And that's so I don't feel the need to give my opinion, because the actual people who are really highly qualified to make this decision have given their opinion. And I think this should really have been a wake-up moment for Germany, because we've had this kind of grift of and a cottage industry of people who've existed and made a lot of money, often from the state, for saying apartheid is anti-Semitic. Well, if the highest court in the world is anti-Semitic, then I think we're losing track of what this word even means,
Yeah. How do you keep optimism within this country?
I'm not an optimist.
You're not an optimist?
In general,
Okay.
I'm not an optimist. I'm not an optimist anywhere. But in Germany, I think we've got a tough decade coming ahead. Let's see what happens in the upcoming state elections when the AfD wins. I will say one thing that I find very positive about German political culture. There are a few things. I do actually quite like the mainstream political culture they have here, where it's quite respectful, quite adult compared to the UK or the US, where politicians are kind of just insulting each other and but maybe that is changing. And I will say that the CDU have recently not been behaving in the same way that they used to, at least on a respectability politics sense. But I really do respect the German refusal to work with the far right. That's a lesson that they have learned from history. And as long as what they call the firewall of cooperation against the far right holds on a state level, national level, I think we can feel a bit safer here from that. At least migrants can. Whereas, in France, we do see some cooperation. We saw the centre-right party then backing the far right in the recent elections. It didn't work out. But ultimately, I think Germany's got tough times, particularly because of the economy. And I don't think it's entirely due to green measures, like a lot of people are saying. I think a lot of the issues with Germany's economy come from the debt brake, which is another hangover from Merkel, which was this constitutional measure that they implemented that basically means they can't borrow money. So if you can't borrow money, that's kind of an okay rule when your economy is going well, because it's calculated, how much you're allowed to borrow is calculated by how much your GDP is and stuff. But when your economy is doing badly, it's like you've tied yourself to a runaway car, or even a car that's like slowing down, because you can't get out of the car, you can't get more gas in the engine. So we're effectively going to see more and more austerity, and a lot of people like cuts to public spending, and a lot of people argue, Isabella Weber, one of them, that can cause a move to the far right through discontent, because when people don't feel prosperous, they often turn on people who are near them but don't look like them, and that's quite often minorities.
Yeah. If you would decide to give yourself a chance of optimism, what would you say to someone who's listening?
I feel like to end on a positive note, I feel like Germany is actually a very nice country to live in a lot of ways. It has good infrastructure, good housing, like the quality of the buildings, some quite boring things which actually make your life a lot better. I love, the bread, the beer, the wine. I'm actually going on holiday to the Schwarzwald soon. So it's a very beautiful country. I mean, the people can be pretty nice as well. And if you pay attention to the news all the time, it can be a bit doom and gloom, because that's also how the news cycle works, right? Like bad news is what sells and what people pay attention to, because it's more significant most of the time. I definitely think we're seeing a bit of a turn in direction for the repression of Palestinian activism. I think a lot of Germans have seen what's happening in Israel with, torture allegations, and are going to be a lot less radically anti-Palestinian. I think people can hope about that. I hope that we can get a bit more of a proper discussion about these issues rather than just shouting each other down with accusations of anti-Semitism or other insults. And I also hope that, we can start to talk to each other, and ultimately that some of the grifters who created this narrative, that the idea that saying apartheid is anti-Semitic, have been exposed. And I think we should continue to expose the grifters and not be afraid to talk to each other and call each other out. But I would say stay comradely and stay polite, because it's not nice to have a shitstorm, and it also probably doesn't get people to listen to each other. So a little bit of a wishy-washy answer at the end, but I still live in Germany. I have some hope for it. It's just I'm usually quite paying attention to what bad thing has happened this week. But when you zoom out of that, I think there is plenty of reason for people to enjoy their life. It's beautiful summer, and we can all enjoy ourselves in Berlin.
Do you see yourself stay in Germany your whole life?
I definitely want to get out this winter. So I've done too many Berlin winters, and I really don't know if I can handle it. But I do love some aspects of life in Germany. I definitely love Berlin. I think it's the greatest city on the planet, except for potentially Mexico City, actually, which I also love. And in general, I don't know about forever. Forever's a long time, but I definitely don't want to go back to the UK right now either. So,
yeah. All right. James Jackson, thank you for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you very much.
The place to be. Welcome to the show. It's the Golden Tide Podcast. It's the people who make the city. It's the city who makes us people so great. Get inspired.